Get onto Facebook. Wonderful. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Thank you, virtual audience, for joining us. It's going to be 115 later this week, so we're really glad that we have this way of kind of sharing our author visits with you. And tonight we have a special guest called Scooter. Some of you have seen him before. I don't know how long he'll stay here, but for the moment, here he is. Right, Scoot? So we are here. Oh dear, I got lipstick on you. I'm sorry. Shows up on a white dog, doesn't it? Yeah. Oh dear. So we are here with the debut of Rosalie Lin, a fantasy debut set in the 1930s in Shanghai, and it has had absolutely rave reviews from all the book media for its world building. I assume you've read your rave reviews and you're pleased with them.
Oh, yes.
Right. So why did you, I guess a pertinent question would be, what was there that drew you to Shanghai? And even so, why would you be there in the 1930s?
That's such a great question. First of all, thank you for inviting me to the Poison Pen. It's my first time being in Phoenix, and this is such a lovely, charming bookstore. I love the ceiling. I've just been staring at it the whole time.
Oh, thank you. Well, once upon a time, and it's a project for us, if you look around, these ceiling photographs are really old. I mean, we've had some of them up there for 25 years or something. And so we really need to refresh our photos. But we're also, because we have an enormous number of them now digitally, we're going to, I think, bring our TV and let them run. Because it's really fun to see all the authors that have visited over the years. But the problem is we just don't have much in the way of space, do we? You know where we could do it is right behind you in front of the fire extinguisher, and then if there's a fire, we're screwed. But that might be the one place, Patrick, where we could actually put it. That wouldn't. We could put. Well, why not? There's a little space between it and the fire extinguisher. We could always reach it. It rolls, so case of emergency,
why not?
First roll the TV, then break the glass, right? It'll all work out. Anyway, sorry. So that was very nice of you to say those kind words, but let's go back to the question first.
Right.
Why Shanghai?
Yeah, so Shanghai in the 1930s to me is such a fascinating time period. So during the time, Shanghai is sort of this glittering wonderland that's extremely diverse. And at the time, there was a lot of fashion, a lot of business coming to Shanghai. But at the same time, also there's this sort of darkness beneath all the glamour because after the first Opium War, Shanghai was kind of signed over to 11 different nations via a treaty, and they forced Shanghai to open as a port. And kind of that treaty allowed all this trade to come in, which led to the city becoming this global, fashionable capital of the East. But at the same time, the city was kind of in chains since there was this forced occupation almost of Shanghai. And so I think I was always drawn to that kind of juxtaposition between the glamour and the darkness. I thought that was really, really interesting to explore.
Are you sorry that you've never gotten, and neither will I, even as though I'm much older than you, to actually walk the Bund back when, in the 1920s? Because I would love. My visit to Shanghai was in 1999. And the island that is now looks like Sydney or Manhattan or Dubai, was basically bare at that point.
Yeah, I've seen photos. When I was doing research for the book, I saw the photos and I was like, wow. But I last went in 2019 around New Year's time.
Yeah.
Or that'd be 2020 during New Year's time, and it was packed. It was really hard to see what was going on. Yeah, I would say there are a lot of things in Shanghai from 1930s that have withstood the test of history and time and are still there. But there's a certain charm from the 1920s, 1930s that's
You're right.
definitely vanished.
I hesitate to say this because it sort of shatters your vision. But when we were there, they were opening their first Kentucky Fried Chicken franchise. And the entire city was lined up, most of it anyway, and it was introducing litter. Because the packaging for something like Kentucky Fried Chicken, so there was a lot of concern about how they were going to police, all of that, and it was near the beautiful garden
Okay, yeah, I think I know the Jingan Garden, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah,
something
yeah.
like that. But anyway, it was like,
That's so
a
interesting.
different
Yeah.
kind of conquest, right? With American
KFC.
commercial food suddenly intruding itself into traditional Shanghai.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
hated it.
You hate it? Did
No,
you
I
go?
no,
No.
no.
I was like, I've been. They do have some interesting twists, like Shanghai twists on fried chicken.
no. I did go to McDonald's when we were in Sharjah, and I was absolutely fascinated by the coffee was okay, but the food, was geared to the people of Sharjah very.
Yes,
So it
yes.
isn't the case that all American franchises have all American,
Yeah.
products they're in. They adapt.
Yeah, that's so interesting that you brought that up. I think I've had the pleasure or displeasure, you could say, of visiting a lot of McDonald's or KFCs in a lot of different countries. At least all the ones in Asia that I've been to, Taiwan, I think Singapore, and then different cities in China. It's really interesting because it's one of the themes that I touch upon in Daughter of Calamity too, is that when you take this one thing from like this cultural icon, and then you translate it to another culture, it takes on its sort of own identity, and it's like you still recognize it's KFC. And like the Chinese name for KFC is really clever because it's called Kentucky, which sounds like Kentucky, but it's just actually it's a play on the word chicken. Yeah. And then they add things like they have porridge for breakfast, which Chinese people love. And then they have egg tart. They have KFC does have some pretty good Portuguese egg tarts, which you wouldn't expect. But
Sure, you would. Macau's not that
not
far
far.
away, so
Okay,
it was
that's valid. Yeah,
it was
yeah.
a Portuguese colony. In fact, we went to Macau when it was. I think Portugal took back or China took back Macau maybe 10 years after Hong Kong, something like that.
Yeah.
And so when we were there, it was still very Portuguese. This is before all the high rises and all the glass towers and all.
Yeah.
China really modernized incredibly fast.
Yeah. Macau these days is known for having a lot of very nice casinos. But also, I'll touch on Macau later. Also.
Okay,
Yeah, with
sorry,
the
I'm
Mother of Calamity.
pushing.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
no, you're bringing up all these interesting points, especially because one thing that really fascinates me is that they still like apply today in 2024.
All right. Well, let's go back to let's go back to why you picked Shanghai, and then why do you pick the 1930s, and I'll stop digressing. You want to get down? Carry on.
He
No,
wants
he's
to-
fine. He'll jump down. That's a good boy.
Okay.
There he goes. All right.
He's back. But yeah, I think I answered the majority of that question. Yeah, I picked the 1930s because it was so fashionable and so glittery, but at the same time, there's that darkness that runs under it. Yeah.
So we have an author called Joseph Cannon, whose book is called Shanghai, who's going to be here Monday. And Shanghai in the 1930s was one of the very few cities that accepted Jewish refugees.
Yes.
So that's why he writes about World War II. So is your book? Do you touch at all upon that idea of immigrants
Yes.
fleeing Europe?
Yes. So in the Shanghai and Daughter of Calamity, there are a lot of immigrants. I think when I was doing research for for Daughter of Calamity, I looked at a variety of sources and I tried to read sources that weren't only written by Westerners, which is generally what I was able to find really easily when I went to the library or looked online. I had to kind of really do some digging to find journals from, for example, cabaret girls. So during the 1930s, there was this kind of rise of almost globally of this icon called the modern girl, sort of stereotype of girl, and she's a working class woman who consumes mass market feminism, so wears makeup, reads magazines, and is very, very fashionable, usually works instead of aspiring to stay at home. And kind of in Shanghai, this phenomenon. So Jing Wen, who's the main character of Daughter of Calamity, is a cabaret girl, and she's a modern girl in the various sense of the word. She dances in a nightclub every night, and a lot of her peers are here from Russia. So after the Bolshevik Revolution, a lot of Russian refugees also came to Shanghai. And so a large number of the dancing girl population came from Russia. And then there were also dancers from Japan. And at the same time, in all the research I did, I was just so fascinated by how diverse Shanghai in the 1930s truly was. When I visited in 2019, I stayed, I think, in the French concession with my sister, Michelle, who's in the audience. And we did come across the sort of like plaque dedicated to the Jewish refugees who came during World War II. And that kind of history is still, like the influences are still there throughout time.
Sure. Well, the 1930s, and recalling my parents, was an era of big bands and ballroom dancing. And the Avalon Ballroom in Chicago, for example, was a, and so there were lots and lots of women who worked in these ballrooms. They weren't like pole dancers or prostitutes or anything. They were, they were there, but they did. Men bought tickets, if I remember it right, and so the girl would accept a ticket, and they would do a dance, but it was, pretty formal. But we've gotten away from those big bands. Go back Glenn Miller and Tommy Dorsey and all of that in this country. So, what kind of music would they have been dancing to? Were they sort of like European or American bands in Shanghai?
Yeah. So they were dancing actually to a lot of American jazz. So they would invite bands and singers from all around the world, but especially from New Orleans. And so, yeah, they would invite bands, orchestras, and from like Havana, Cuba. I think these were the two instances I read about. And yeah, so singers, bands would travel to Shanghai and join in on the fun. Dancing culture was really huge in the 1930s.
It really was globally,
Yeah.
so I'm not surprised it was.
Sad I missed out. I love dancing, so.
Well, yeah, when I was in high school was when we first began to get, rock and other stuff. And so those older dancing skills, learning how to foxtrot and waltz and all that stuff nobody cared anymore. Well, they didn't.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, the foxtrot was, there's a famous short story called Shanghai Foxtrot, which was set in the 1930s about a dancing club there. Yeah. These days, I guess, people listen to EDM, which is a different kind of dancing. Yeah.
So tell us about the grandmother, because she's really fascinating.
Yeah, so Jingwen's grandmother and Daughter of Calamity, she is a surgeon for the most powerful gang in Shanghai, and she has sort of made them more powerful by making them silver limbs that are made out of melted swords. So that's a fantasy element that was added. Jingwen's grandmother, as opposed to Jingwen, the two of them represent two very different forms of power. So whereas I was talking about how Jingwen is a modern girl and she represents kind of this very feminine sort of power, Jingwen's grandmother, she grew up in an older era where men had almost total complete power. Most of the families were patriarchal, which is left over from Confucian times. And so Jingwen's grandmother, she aspires to become a surgeon. That's traditionally a very masculine profession, and she excels at it, and that's her pride. And so when she sees Jingwen become a dancing girl, she's a little bit upset because she's like, I wanted to take you as my apprentice and teach you my craft. My craft makes me an equal with the most powerful entity, in her opinion, in Shanghai. And she's kind of hurt and confused why Jingwen doesn't want a part of that. And so she's a very complex person. I've been describing her as the morally gray grandmother. I would say that she makes a lot of decisions out of what she thinks is right, but it's not necessarily what would keep the largest number of people safe. Let's just say it that way.
So you kind of slid by the silver limb thing, but maybe you could amplify that. What exactly is she doing?
Yeah, and so when I wrote Daughter of Calamity, I kind of really wanted to come up with my own take on sort of the Industrial Revolution in Shanghai and technology and medicine and how kind of that all influences mythology itself. So in Daughter of Calamity, one thing you'll notice that I changed about history is that there are no guns in this world. Instead, I have elevated the ancient magic up with technology, and instead of having Western weapons, a lot of the characters have swords, and because of Jingwen's grandmother, the gangs in Shanghai, they have silver hands or silver legs, although silver hands are more popular, and this allows them to have more skill when they fight. And so I thought that it's really interesting because this is a point of contention among the different factions of Shanghai at the time. So in the 1930s, there's a population within Shanghai, especially among those with power, who want Shanghai to stay a very traditional Chinese city. And on the other hand, there's another population that wants to embrace the change that's coming from westernization. And so Jingwen's grandmother very much stands on the we want to stay traditional, but at the same time, she's sort of a hypocrite in that opinion because she has come up with this own like version of what's happening, incorporating this like she's basically helping the gangsters elevate their way of fighting with these silver limbs.
Oh, wait, when you say that, does that mean she amputates the limb that they have and replaces it with a metal limb, or does she encase the arm in silver?
Okay, so this is a spoiler, but cover your ears if you don't want to hear. But I'll explain. So she actually does amputate the limb, and what happens to the limbs actually is that they get sold on the black market. Or do you want me to spoil it?
Well, it's your story. But I mean, I think when you say silver limb, that we probably do need to kind of explain what that means, because I think most people would think that somehow she creates like a metal sheath for
All
the.
right.
I did when I
When you
first
read it?
started reading it, and
Okay.
maybe I'm wrong, but
Yeah, I'll dig in. So Jingwen's grandmother does amputate the limb, and the limbs get sold on the black market. For a lot of these limbs, they do fall into the hands of some very opportunistic businessmen. And there's a throwaway line in a scene later on where some of these limbs, they get ground into powder and sold as dragon bones from the Orient on the streets of New York City. And so I think that was basically a nod to how hungry the city is and to that darkness that comes with the opportunities in Shanghai.
I think that's pretty ingenious,
Yeah,
actually.
yeah. It's
You know.
an ingenious scam.
Well, but I mean, there's a lot going on today in like trafficking organs and other things. So I don't know if people selling their kidneys or whether it's that different, that if
Yeah.
somebody sacrifices an arm.
Yeah, that's what that was a nod to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I can certainly. Well, but you wouldn't have to do the same kind of matching. I mean, it's much more complex to translate to donate a kidney. But
Oh yes.
if you cut out an arm and then eventually it turns into something else, then, there doesn't have to be
Process
super science or medicine involved in that.
Yeah.
Right.
Very true.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I thought that was a really ingenious element of the book, this idea of these guys with silver limbs that were able then to, triumph. Do they also study martial arts? I mean, in addition to having silver limbs, are you playing anything on Chinese martial arts as well?
Yes, the gangsters. So a history of the gangs in Shanghai, where a lot of them actually descended from the martial arts cults, from like the Middle Ages and beyond. And so as the cities modernized, especially Shanghai and Hong Kong. Hong Kong's another big place where this happened. Those martial arts cults, which are very, very big on family, and almost like a Western mafia sense. Like they're big on family, big on like loyalty to each other, and then they're very big on business also. That kind of also had to modernize. And in the 1930s in Shanghai, that turned into the gangs. Pretty much.
So what about transportation? If you're in the 1930s, are most people coming to Shanghai by ship at this point still?
Yes, by ship.
Not so much by air. I've always wanted to go to back in time so that I could go to Singapore and stay at Raffles and
A raffle.
go to. I know. Unfortunately, Raffles today is not the Raffles that it once was. So
Yeah, I've been to the raffles.
have you?
Today, yeah.
right.
I can't imagine what it was like back then, though.
Well, no, and then we'll get into a whole story of colonialism and all, which we don't need to do. But it's just kind of, mythic memories of 19th century Asia, which was not really Asia, but to a great degree a European, kind of
Extension.
overlay imposed upon it, especially in Shanghai. Yeah, you mentioned concessions. Tell us about those, because I think that you already sort of mentioned the idea.
Yeah, so there were two major concessions in Shanghai in the 1930s, which was the French concession, which kind of had a French municipality, and then the international settlement, which was actually a lot of different countries I guess, all the countries that weren't France. Or Japan. And then Japan had a separate presence. That was, Japan was there. And there was actually one of the books I read to do research for Daughter of Calamity is called a novel called Shanghai by a Japanese postmodernist author called Yokomitsu Riichi. And in there, the characters, they're a bunch of disillusioned businessmen who come from Japan and their factories are all failing. And the Chinese are plotting a revolution to overthrow their factory overlords, and they're very worried. But they have this idea of Pan-Asianism, which is that they think Asia is meant to be the superpower of the world, and so Asia has to come together because right now Asia is too disorganized, and Japan is going to be the country to unite Asia. So that was, I think, an interesting element that I hadn't known before doing that bit of research. So that was really interesting to read about. There are all these different shifting factions in Shanghai. There's a local Chinese gangs who want to maintain control of the city, even though some of them are corrupt and they do bargain with foreigners. And then you have the Japanese presence, which is Pan-Asianist. They want to also take control of Shanghai as part of unifying Asia under one power. And then you also have the Western nations who are there more for economic reasons.
Absolutely true. But the Chinese, remind me, Patrick, because you too read the same book about, Nanking. Didn't the Japanese pretty much had taken over Nanking. In fact, it was horrific the way they took over. So they're not that far away.
No, they're not that far away. They are quickly encroaching upon Shanghai.
Right.
Yeah.
In Joe's book that I was going to talk about Monday, one of the you have to have an antagonist, to construct a really good thriller, is a Colonel Yamada, who, we know for sure is like, approaching Shanghai from a Japanese conquest perspective. I mean, that they're eyeing taking over, especially the port cities, right? Because it's Japan's right across the water.
Yeah. And the ports are so valuable for trade at that time. Everything was done by ship, so. Yeah.
Absolutely. So the grandmother, are there spirits in this book? Tell us a bit about the religion and various other sort of offshoots.
Yeah, so I'm really fascinated by comparative myth. I was a comparative literature major in college, which meant I got to read literature from all around the world and kind of see how similar concepts have been translated between different literary cultures. And I was actually first inspired by myself being confused in high school when I would visit all these temples in China. My dad lived in China when I was growing up, so I spent a lot of my summer vacation there. And there would be Buddhist temples and Taoist temples. And when I was a kid, I would wonder what's the difference between the two of them. And they actually share a lot of similar deities or figures, like religious figures. For example, in all these temples, I would notice, and this is actually true probably of a lot of religions in the world, there is a central like mother figure, like one goddess that's always portrayed in a major hall. And I noticed that this version of this goddess in the Buddhist temples was different from the ones in the Taoist temples. The ones in the Buddhist temple, like her name is Guanyin, and she's these days known as the goddess of compassion or the goddess of mercy. And then her counterpart, which in a lot of Taoist temples is portrayed as slightly more feral, is a redeemed demon who is actually the mother of Calamity, who features as a major character in Daughter of Calamity. But all these goddesses are actually the same person. And I later learned that the name Goddess of Mercy for Guanyin actually came from the Christian missionaries who were in Shanghai at the time. They saw this goddess and was like, that's your Virgin Mary. And so we're going to call her the Goddess of Mercy. And that name has persisted through these times. Like even when I talk to my friends who are Chinese American and you ask them about Guanyin, they'll use that title because it became so commonplace. And that kind of shifted the identity of that goddess almost in the popular history, like the folk history of China. And then when I went to Japan, I went to Taiwan, that same goddess then became another figure named Mazu, and she was a seafaring goddess because a lot of people had traveled by boat from China to Taiwan. And so there was a huge golden temple dedicated to Mazu that was neither Buddhist nor Taoist. It was just a folk, like a regional religion temple in Taipei. And so I think kind of seeing that really inspired me to incorporate mythology and religion in Daughter of Calamity. And to me, that kind of ties into the characters themselves. For example, Jing Wen, she has a different name in every language that she actively uses in Shanghai. So she has a different name in Chinese than in English when she's a dancer girl. She mainly uses English when she's interacting with the patrons of the dance club, who are mostly foreigners. And then she has another name in Japanese that has a more like sorrowful tint to the name. And so, kind of this translation of identities and like the masks we all wear, that's a huge part of Daughter of
It
Calamity.
really is. I love the way you say feral, a feral goddess. I mean, really, well, they're they're Greek goddesses. I
Yeah.
mean, if you go
Yeah.
back and really look at Greek mythology, they're not all well intentioned and
Oh, definitely
benevolent,
not.
and
Definitely not.
no,
Yeah.
they could be pretty and very close to nature. I always thought that Taoist, to some degree, was was like that Greek, where there was a very strong tie between nature
Yes.
and the
Yes.
figures. So I
Yes.
mean, in
Yeah.
Greece it would be like, the
Mhm.
stream has a goddess and the
Mhm.
tree has a god and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
So isn't it quite whereas Buddhism I thought was a bit more spiritual.
Yeah, Buddhism is a bit more philosophical and, as you said, spiritual. And Taoism kind of more has elements of folk religion. So before either of these two religions really like solidified, there were a lot of like smaller religions with a lot of legends that were practiced by the local people. And then that kind of got absorbed into a lot of it got absorbed into Taoism. It's so interesting that you mentioned Greek and Roman mythology, because in Shanghai, there was at the time a lot of buildings that were built by the foreigners who came that was inspired by that, and that was something that I also considered and looking into. And it's just so fascinating how different mythologies that almost form independent of each other still have these shared elements.
So were you
Yeah.
talking about something similar to a Greek temple in
Oh
construction?
no, like the nightclubs would have
Oh, the
columns in
nightclubs. Oh,
them, and
okay.
yeah,
Gotcha.
yeah.
Wow.
Nightclubs, parks, probably.
And on
Yeah,
a really crass
gardens.
note, one of my absolute favorite memories of somewhere in China, I can't remember, is we went to a Buddhist temple, and outside they had a little god, and he had a bucket next to him, and it said on the sign on the bucket, it said, "Pay money, become Buddha." I've
I
always
love
remembered
that.
that.
Oh no,
It's just,
that's such a great example of that. That
right.
kind of thing happens in Daughter of Calamity. And I think as because like I've always wondered, like the ancient gods, like what do they think now that we are such a heavily capitalistic, hustling society? Like how do they hustle? And on one of my trips to China, I think I actually noticed that back then it might have been a bucket. Now it's a QR code, and you can Venmo. You can Venmo.
QR code. That's really
Yeah.
coming. Well, but if you go, I mean, I've been in lots of temples in Asia, and food offerings are particularly, even in like Bangkok and so forth. If you go to various temples, so I think there was always an offering,
Yes.
kind of a
Yeah.
strategy or interact, whatever you want to call
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
between mortals and gods. And
Yes.
pay money, become Buddha just meant you turned it into money instead of
Kind of.
giving them like a
Yeah.
wine or
Yeah.
cakes or something.
Very true. Yeah, to add on to that, in the ancient times of China, there was actually a lot of ancestor worship, which kind of passes into the traditions of today. But basically, your ancestors, when they're ghosts in heaven, they can only eat when the living offer them food. And so before, there would be many days where farmers, etc., at the time it was a very agrarian society, they would offer and burn wheat and alcohol to their ancestors. And it was considered a very sad thing if you didn't have any living descendants, because then as a ghost in heaven, you would just starve. And so that kind of eventually translated to making offerings to other deities in Buddhism and Taoism. And today, sometimes we Venmo.
Sure. Well,
our
ghosts,
gods.
ghosts are, I think, a
Yeah.
really powerful part of, you know, Asian, particularly Chinese. So I remember
Mhm.
in Xi'an, I think it was, it's the gateway to the Silk Road from China. There's a Jewish temple, there's a Arab mosque, and there's a Chinese temple, and it has one of those moon gates. And they told us, I don't know if this is true or not, the reason the moon gate is round and it's elevated is that they believe the ghosts couldn't pass through the moon gate. They couldn't step over the the sill of the gate, which I thought was really fascinating. As a way of protection from ghosts was that you could put up a moon gate and keep the ghosts out. But then right there next to it was, as they say, was a mosque, and over here was a synagogue. And I thought, I love the fact that China, this is 1990, 99 or whatever it is, but it was so cosmopolitan, or there were so many cultures like right there together, somehow or other coexisting.
Yeah, so I've actually visited that same trio, the synagogue, the mosque, and the temple when I was in Xi'an in 2014, I think, in October 2014. I'm really glad to hear that actually goes back in history. But you're right that, it's really interesting always to see, it's not even institutions, like physical places that belong to different cultures occupying the same space, and to think about how they interact.
Absolutely. And I mean, the whole point of the terracotta warriors was, to protection from the emperor. His burial. Did they tell you the story of the emperor when he died?
Oh, you mean the part where he commissioned all the terracotta
No,
warriors?
no. This is my favorite thing, and I'm trying to remember what his actual name was. But it is the guy that he was hadn't really worked out a succession plan. He had unified China to whatever point that was, and he was off doing something, and he died. And because they didn't have a succession plan or whatever, he had a carriage that had a very high seat. So they put ice in it, and they put him on ice, and they toured him around for, I think it was 2 years or something, hoping that he wouldn't disintegrate before they brought him back in.
Oh, I didn't hear
There's
that
a
part
whole
of the
movie.
story.
There's a whole long, by the Terracotta Warriors, there's a whole like tourist thing, and they have a whole movie about it where they're showing it. But anyway, when they did, finally they created all these warriors and buried them in order. And he, in theory, in his tomb, is floating on a lake of Mercury.
Oh, yeah. So
that part you probably did
his name is Qin Shi Huang. So he was the first technically emperor who unified all the different kingdoms into China. And then legend has it that he was trying to achieve immortality. So he hired some alchemists to cook up I think it was cinnabar in the end that he drank. Yeah, it was cinnabar, and then he died of cinnabar poisoning. And then he made this army to be his fighters in the afterlife. So they would protect him in the
So
afterlife.
it was sort of a suicide. I didn't realize that.
Accidental. He was trying to achieve immortality. Like, if I drink this, I will become immortal. And you can't let anyone test it out, because then they'll become immortal too. So,
got it. Anyway, his tomb has never been opened, and part of it is that in theory, and I've always sort of wondered how they collected enough mercury, it may just be a myth, but Steve Barry wrote one of his books and said it in that area, and we talked about it, and he'd really looked into it, and there is some validity to this idea that, that they haven't opened the tomb because of the text.
The mercury?
Yeah, of the mercury. So anyway, it's probably one of those things one day will happen, just like they might one day discover Genghis Khan's tomb by using LiDAR. I think, that's probably what will actually happen, because nobody knows exactly where it is.
Yeah. I absolutely believe that there's mercury down there. That's so I've been doing a lot of research into Chinese alchemy for my next book, which will and heavy metals feature very prominently. Like, all the alchemists will cook up things with mercury, sulfur, cinnabar, crystals, etc. Yeah, and so
that is exciting.
Yeah.
So, what do you think? What do you think excited all the critics who have talked about your world building? Have any of them been specific, or is it a more general love the world building, but actually saying which parts of it move them?
I think to answer that question, I would say, from my perspective, when I wrote Daughter of Calamity, my favorite part, but also I put a lot of effort and thought into kind of creating an experience for the reader. Like, I really, really wanted it to be so that when someone reads Daughter of Calamity and they visit each of these nightclubs in Shanghai, and each one has a different personality, they really feel like they're there. Like, on a night where you don't want to go out, maybe because it's too hot, and you're at home in bed reading, you'll feel like you're transported there. For me, that was a challenge for myself. I really, really wanted to make that come to life. And I was when I did write that, I looked at a lot of accounts of the Chinese cabarets that have been left from history, both in Chinese, in English, and in translation from Japanese. And I just wanted to capture that feeling of seeing these clubs dripping in gold. And then you walk in and they're just super, super luxurious. And they're basically fantasy worlds that you step into to be transported away. So it made me really, really happy when I heard that reviewers and critics picked up on that, and that they shared in that. I was like, I guess I'm successful in what I wanted.
Yes, no, I think you were very successful. Do you think of this in part as a coming of age story?
I think so. For Jingwen, it is a coming of age story. She's 20 and she begins as the novel as a kind of controversial character. She's very petty, which was very fun to write. A lot of the dancer girls in the beginning, they're out to get money for themselves. So they're very petty. And then she has to kind of grow and learn what truly matters to her throughout the book.
No, there's many elements to really enjoy. Anybody have any questions they would like to ask? PK?
Yeah, one of the things I really loved about the book is that it's urban fantasy in a lot of ways, and I noticed that a lot of your world building was very similar to Fonda Lee in terms of the fact that it was incredibly grounded at the same time. And when you're writing urban fantasy, you can either go kind of really far, heavily into the fantasy, or you can lean more towards, you know, um, historical or modern representation without skewing too far out. And you tend to go more towards kind of the fantasy as an undertone, which I really loved. So, is that how the book started, or was this something that you just sort of developed or decided that you wanted to do?
I love that you picked up on that. So yeah, the Shanghai and Daughter of Calamity, I almost wanted the fantasy elements to be like the characters don't question them because this is the Shanghai they know. The Shanghai they know is weird and strange, because it's such a fascinating place. And so the characters will see something weird. Like Jinwen will go to her grandmother's clinic and the incense smoke will like swirl around her head in a halo. And she'll be like, oh, like maybe it's actually doing that. Maybe I'm imagining it. And kind of there's a sort of like undercurrent of fabulism where the fantasy elements could be real or they could be like an exaggeration that the characters are experiencing because the time is so chaotic. So it's definitely lighter on the fantasy. One of the first drafts I wrote was actually just historical fiction. I added the fantasy later when I realized that one of the things I love about fantasy is that it really helps you accentuate the parts of the story or the message that you're trying to tell. And then I added that in later.
Very good question.
Yeah,
You
that's
should
a
be
really
sitting
good
here
question.
instead of me.
That was a very good
All right.
question.
So one of the things I found interesting is that so often in a kind of a coming of age story, it's the immediate parent. It's mother and child, or father and child, whichever way it goes. So having the grandmother, I thought was interesting, and also because there's always this element of respect for elders ingrained in I think Chinese families and all that. Did you feel like making it the grandmother, not the mother, was a part of what you wanted to say?
Oh, that's like also a really interesting note to pick up on because if you notice, the title of the book is Daughter of Calamity, not Granddaughter of Calamity. And I think that when I came up with a title for this book and we were thinking about it, because Mother of Calamity was another choice, I really wanted to touch on the fact that the matrilineal kind of line in Daughter of Calamity is really important. So at the center of the story, you have Jingwen, who is the youngest. She's the generation that really came of age in the 1930s. And then before that, you have her mother, who's also a cabaret dancer, but her mother is kind of less empowered in her becoming a cabaret dancer. She did this because she felt like this is what you had to do. Versus Jingwen, when she's a cabaret dancer, she's much more like intentional in what she's doing. And then you have the grandmother who ascribes to a more traditional way of thinking. However, to me, the bloodline goes even further back. And so one thing I really wanted was for Shanghai to kind of be a character and to also be a part of that bloodline. And same with the actual mother of Calamity, who's the goddess who is very, she has a lot, this goddess has a lot of opinions about how Shanghai has changed, especially around her temple. And so all of them together, they view the 1930s and all these shifting dynamics in a different way, but they are all one bloodline in my mind.
Yeah, they are. The other thing to remember is that Shanghai is the port city for China. Beijing is kind of off up in a corner, and not geographic. Sort of like Washington D.C. is not really where you'd think the U.S. capital would be. It was a compromise, right? And Beijing, Xi'an was much more reasonable if you think about it. Back when
Well, historically, Xi'an
yeah,
was the
I mean it was
capital, yeah.
out there in the middle. It kind of made sense. But Shanghai is at the mouth of the, the yellow.
Pearl River
Right.
Delta.
Yeah. And so it was economically much more important than Beijing, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. I don't know when Beijing became I think because of the different states and the shifting dynasties. Xi'an used to be the capital of China because it was sort of the last stop in China of the Silk Road, and that made a lot of sense. Shanghai, while being a very, very bustling port, was not the capital, possibly because there was so much, by that time, a foreign influence in the city. I think it would have been hard. Yeah.
No, I know. But I mean, so if you were going to, you really wouldn't have written this book in Beijing. Is sort of the point
That's
I
so
was
funny
making.
that you said, because the first, very, very first draft of Daughter of
Was
Calamity
in
was set in
Beijing.
Beijing. But something wasn't clicking right. Like something just didn't click about the world. And then when I visited Shanghai for the first time, it fell together. And I was like, this is the place.
Yeah, I think there's much more romance attached,
Yeah, there's this feeling that when you go to Shanghai, and I think that it's left over from this culture of dancing that was there. It's like hints of it still live in the architecture and the structure of the city.
Well, I also think that a lot more people that were not Chinese visited Shanghai than Beijing in this time
At
too.
that time,
Beijing was
yeah.
harder to get to, and so if you were
Definitely.
primarily traveling by ship, Shanghai and Hong Kong would have been, much more accessible to you.
Yeah, that's very
Right.
true.
Right. Anybody else besides Pat? Or do you have another brilliant point? Oh, excellent.
Did you have a favorite gangster that you absolutely loved writing in this book? Because it's such a great era to and a place.
Oh my God, you're right. The 1930s is the gangster era,
Yeah,
isn't it?
yeah.
Yeah, I should have thought of that.
Oh, that's true. You mean within Daughter of
Within
Calamity?
Daughter of Calamity, do you have somebody that you absolutely love bringing in or just learning about even?
Yeah. Oh, I would say the leader of the Blue Dawn. He's very serious and never smiles. He was very fun to write. Yeah. He just commands respect with his RBF, his silent face. Yeah.
So you've mentioned you have a second book coming. Can you give us just a few hints about that?
Oh, I think so. As I mentioned, there's going to be a lot of alchemy in it. It's set way further back in history in the year 500, and it's about a girl who grows up in a cult of assassins. I'll just say that much.
That sounds wonderful. So in 1930s, Shanghai had foot binding largely been abandoned. It would have been really tough to be a dancer, cabaret dancer, if your feet were bound.
So that's a really good question because my own grandmother was born in 1929, and I think it was gone by then. But she was telling me about her mother, and they would bind their feet as kids, and then they would just undo it again. Like the kids would be like, "Oh, this is uncomfortable," and then they would just unwrap it again. And so I think that largely fell out of fashion by then.
I wondered when the Empress died, because that was
in
what,
the
like
1990s.
1911 or early 19, whatever it was. I wondered if that was kind of,
Yeah, I think that's a historical point. I'll have to check whether or not the last dynasty, which was, I think they were Manchurian by bloodline, whether or not they bound their feet. I'm not sure. That's something I have to check.
I don't know. I'm
Yeah.
steeped in Lisa C. So everything I know about foot biting, I have learned from, Snowflower. And then if you haven't read it, you really might want to read Lady Tan, her most recent book, which I think is totally fascinating.
What's it called?
What is the whole title? Lady Tan's. Anyway, it's earlier, and it's about a woman who wants to be a doctor. She comes from a line where the women perforce have to be midwives, right? But foot binding, her mother dies from an infection because if you didn't really tend your feet,
Oh yeah.
you would wind up with, I'm assuming, gangrene. Lady Tan's Circle of Women. That's it.
Okay,
Yep.
I'll look into that.
You really should, just
Yeah.
because I think there are elements in it that Lisa had a Chinese, was it grandfather or great grandfather? Do you remember? He came to California. It was the Gold Mountain thing. He came to California and left his family
That'd be San Francisco.
in China. So she is blonde and blue-eyed, but nonetheless has
Wow,
a
that's
Chinese. And
interesting.
she wrote a book called Snowflower and the Secret
I've
Fan,
heard of that one.
which
It became
was
a movie. Yeah.
right. But before that, interestingly enough, she wrote 3 mysteries set in Japan, and they were kind of at that time contemporary Japan. One of them involved one of the Ryukyu, one of the amazing scepters and so forth. And then she wrote Snowflower, and she's never looked back in terms of writing Chinese history. But she also has looked at ghosts, and she's looked at, it's always in the perspective of women. And Snowflower and the Secret Fan was about writing, that women were able to write messages to each other on fans. And that was how they were able to communicate in a very repressive culture where they weren't able to do that easily.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think foot binding in China, the history of it is also really fascinating. I did a long research project about it in college. And so in like the 1600s, 1500s Ming Dynasty, it was actually, there's an account of these 3 women who were actually kind of like assassins, and they like rode horses and went around with bound feet. And then it's more, at the time, it was kind of seen, kind of like how we would see now, like a boob job, like plastic surgery, which also comes, of course, with a lot of risk because it's a plastic surgery that's not really done with like clinical grade care. But that's kind of really how the women viewed it, is that I think a lot of women, I think in these days, a lot of the way it gets translated is that foot binding is a way that was used to oppress women. But if you read a lot of accounts that were actually written by ladies and princesses in the 1500s, especially like I was always really fascinated by this series of short stories, or they weren't, it was like an autobiography of these 3 I think they were noble women who would go around and they could shoot arrows and ride horses. And it was really seen kind of as like, basically like we see breast augmentation these days, or like a Brazilian butt
I've never
lift.
quite figured out because, they have these little teeny feet that they wobble on. It was like a lotus or something. I never understood why that was sexy. I mean, that was sort of the motivation, was that men would find this little tiny, they just tottered, they couldn't actually walk. The Metropolitan Museum years ago, the Costume Institute at the Met in New York, maybe you've been there. Well, I meant the Costume Institute in particular is one of my favorite things. And they did a whole exhibition some years ago on dragon robes, which were gorgeous. But as part of that, they had these little teensy, and I mean, we're talking like this.
2 inches, 1.5 inches was
of
the
slippers for the bound feet. But the other thing they had was the fingernail shields, because that was another part of it, is that women grew these enormously long fingernails, and then they had metal sheets, sort of like your silver. And so the impression you got at the Costume Institute, what they were basically saying was that these made women almost entirely ornamental. They couldn't use their hands, and they couldn't really walk, and therefore they had to be taken care of. And so it was sort of a class thing. It was a statement that their family or their husband or whoever, their brother, whoever was looking after them, was rich and could afford to have, somebody caretaking this basically kind of helpless, like a doll,
Yeah.
female.
So they would actually have a lot of attendants who were also girls, but it's kind of sort of, I see it more like it would be the equivalent of today if you got like a ridiculous plastic surgery, and it would make it really hard to get around. And then, but the women themselves, they view it as like this great, like, surplus to their beauty. I went to a similar exhibit in Beijing. I forget which museum because I was really young, and I remember the first time I saw that I think it was 1.5 inches was the I'm probably slightly off on that, but the very tiny, the shoe. Yeah, of I think one of the most famous concubines in history, and her little silk shoes. Yeah.
However, I'm not sure how much of it was voluntary because my understanding was that they were very, very young.
Yes,
when-
they are very, very young.
And so
yeah.
they didn't volunteer for it
Yeah.
like you might do for plastic surgery, but their mothers basically
That's true.
their mothers had it done, and they
Yeah.
thought their daughters, but they also thought that it would gain them a rich husband, and it was it was a way to give their daughters a better life, even if they were basically caging them up.
Yeah.
So there we are. I don't know. I mean, cultures have, so I'm always fascinated at how cultures devise these barbaric practices, and somehow or other, and it goes on.
One of the things that I really
Like plastic surgery. I don't disagree with you about that.
In the
one
modern
of the
day.
things I really like right now is that there is this big influx of Asian American fantasy voices.
Yeah.
So we've got Chloe Vong, Fonda Lee, Naivo, and they're really bringing in, and now
The
you
Fox
guys
wife. Yeah.
bringing in these really wonderful voices and bringing the cultures into and explaining them to us through kind of fantasy elements. So I'm just curious, how does that feel to be one of those voices now, one of those major voices in modern literature?
Oh wow. I think kind of thinking about when I was a kid growing up, there wasn't really I mean, actually as when I was younger, there was no representation of Asian Americans in YA fantasy, at least. I think that Amy Tan was writing at the time adult fiction, but I still remember the first book I read that featured an Asian, like a Chinese main character, and that was Silver Phoenix by Cindy Pon. I reached out to Cindy Pon a couple of weeks ago, actually, telling her that this was my dream since I was in high school, and I finally achieved it. And I wanted to thank her for making me realize. I still remember like the cover very distinctively. It's very, very Chinese, and that was not present in a lot of book covers at that time. And then since then, I think that I'm able to publish Daughter of Calamity because a lot of authors before me, like R.F. Kuang, etc., have opened the doors to make this a possibility. But when things get hard, I think about, I want to keep going to increase representation and share all these very fascinating bits of Chinese history and mythology that I know from both my personal research and from traveling.
Have you run across The Fox Wife? It's almost, in a way, it's fantasy, but it's also a detective story. Yeah, or Jew. I made it a book of the month for us a little while back, and Lisa C and I did the conversation together. But she's Manchurian, Northern China Manchurian
That's so cool.
spirit that moves from being a fox to a woman.
Okay, I know this book. Yeah.
So, I mean, I thought that was fascinating too, but it was less fantasy and more, I thought, in the sort of ghost tradition,
And there was a great book called Hungry Ghost, and I'm trying to think of who wrote it, and I want to say that it was a horror novel, maybe Japanese, that was about ghosts who weren't fed, so they came back as vengeful spirits. It was really fun.
That sounds very fun.
Hungry
yeah.
ghost. That's a
Yeah.
scary thing
Hungry
right there.
ghosts are the best ghosts. Yeah.
Anybody else have as a sister, do you have any comments you'd like to add to this whole thing?
Wow.
The hot seat.
Hot seat. Wow. If you could tell so for context, I still have a copy of the book that Jess wrote when we were like 8 on my end, 9 for her. Like the first book she ever wrote. Like she was writing back then and had this dream to be a writer. If you could tell that 9-year-old self something from now, what would it be?
Oh wow, that's such a great question. That's a really hard one. I cringe to think that you still have that my first book I wrote when I was 8 years old. I'm sure it was very cringy. I think I would tell my younger self that embrace who you are. Start writing the things you know, and yeah. eventually you will face a lot of rejection, but you'll get there someday. That's what I
Very
would say.
nice. Patrick, are there any online questions?
There is a question. It's kind of a personal question.
Okay.
Are you a practicing Buddhist, or what religion, if any, do you practice?
Oh, well, I guess I'm technically an atheist. However, I do admire a lot of religions, and I study a lot of religions and their history, and I find that really fascinating.
There's a question about the martial arts that you alluded to earlier from the 30s.
Mm-hmm.
What were they called at that time? What were some of
Oh, that's kind of a fun question, but I would say that each different uh, clan, or at the time they were gangs, they probably had their own like secret technique, family technique, that's passed down, and only that like group would know that technique. And so they would have fun names, like I'm just making this up, like like I don't know, mountain shaking punch or something. It would be like a special technique that they would train. In terms of broader martial arts, there would be a lot of sword play. I'm not a martial artist, so I can't touch on the like specific techniques. I'm sure there's more to it, because if you ask me the same question about dance, I'm like, I know the specifics. In terms of martial arts, I only know that fun fact, but like what family and like history of martial art it comes from, I do not know.
What about your current book that you're writing that's set in with the year 500 or something?
Yeah.
Like that? What are the challenges of having characters start talking and speaking?
Ooh. That's a really good question, because at the time they would have been speaking a completely different language, and I'm putting everything here in English. This was actually a really interesting question when we were recording the Daughter of Calamity audiobook, is when there were names like Jingwen, did I want her name to be pronounced with an American accent or Chinese? And kind of the answer to that question, like the experience for the reader is different than like what it actually is. So I ended up asking C, the narrator, to pronounce all the younger characters' names with an American accent, which when you listen to the book would kind of reflect how they're like culturally like up to date, etc. Meanwhile, the grandmother would pronounce the same words with a Chinese accent, etc. And so when you write in English about like in other languages, technically characters speaking in other languages, I just think it's so fascinating, like how the author chooses to like artistically change that to make an experience for the reader. And that's something that I really got to think about when we were kind of coming up with the pronunciations for the audiobook. In 500, the characters probably spoke a version of Chinese that I, in this day, would not understand. It was, and what's actually really interesting writing about that era is I have to Google everything. Like I had a character sweeping the floor, and then I realized I was imagining a broom, like the kind of broom we have, like a stick with twigs at the end. And I was like, I don't actually know if brooms look like that. And it was not easy to find information about what brooms looked like in 530
The good
China.
thing is you can kind of make it up, right? A little
That's
bit.
true. That's true.
It's fantasy. You know, I mean, Patrick, it's kind of the same problem. You know, if you want to write in English in the time of Chaucer, you know, nobody has ever, I mean, if you ever tried to read the Canterbury Tales in the original, you know, good luck. And so I think, you know, I think when you're writing fiction, you have to, you know, you have to make the leap that, one of the best things, however, I will throw this out because I think it's the only example I can think of, and I really love this. Susanna Kersley wrote a book called The Shadowy Horses, and it was set in northern England and based on the actual disappearance of one of the Roman legions. I think it was the 9th or something, but literally vanished, and nobody ever knew what happened to them. So the sort of conceit of the book is that one of the legionnaires comes back to life. And at that point, in most books, everybody would be talking to him, right? In this book, it's only the little kid who's studying Latin in school that has any chance of talking to this revived Roman soldier who amazingly only speaks Latin. And, you know, and I love that because, you know, there's this sort of like fourth wall or whatever it is, and I thought it was so realistic. So the little kid takes on a remarkably, he's not that little, maybe he's 12 or something, he's in school studying Latin, takes on a really important role in a book where otherwise he might really have just been relegated to the sideline as a kid, but he's the only Latin speaker present. So it's part fantasy, but it's also, kind of realistic.
Yeah.
Or you could do like what Jim Butcher did with the Codex Alera series, where you take the Lost Roman Legion and you put them into an entirely new fantasy where they actually cross over, so that you don't have to worry about that. Into a different reality.
Well, she actually was writing more historical fiction with this element. I mean, it's not really a book I would call fantasy, but then again, it doesn't really history. That's the great thing about fiction. It doesn't have to be any one thing, right?
Yeah.
It can be whatever story that the author wants to tell.
Yeah.
And readers really need to embrace that.
Yeah, you can make a lot of creative choices. Yeah.
Absolutely. I know. It's
I love this because it's historical, it's a little bit of fantasy, and it's a lot of adventure, and it's just so much fun to read.
It is. There's again, I can't remember titles or maybe even authors, but there was a really brilliant book written about 1920 Shanghai, where it might have been called the. No, it wasn't. He's a British author. He's a journalist.
Is it Devil in the
No,
Devil in the something city?
no, that's
No, that's about Chicago, but it's
Yeah.
it has the word devil and city in it. It was one of the books I read to do research for. Yeah, Paul something. He's a journalist, and it's about like a murder in Shanghai, right?
Yeah, he's been here.
He did something with
But it was very.
Yeah, he has a
No,
several.
it's a different guy. I know who you're talking about. You're talking about the guy that wrote about. I hate being old because this is what happens is your memory.
The City of Devils is the one I'm talking about. Paul French. Yeah, that's the
Yeah,
one we're
but no, I'm talking about he's a British journalist that covers the royal family or something. He's written a number of books that all of which I've liked, but I'm trying to remember what I think he called it the Bund, but I might be wrong. But anyway, it was a very I don't want to say romantic, but it was a version of Shanghai in the 1920s from a very European perspective. And I was always sad that I didn't, get to walk along the river and sort of see it that way, because all of that is gone. It'll never come back. And it's a good thing for, the people in China, that whole, but it was just a very almost romantic kind of look at the city.
memory. Yeah.
But romantic from a European standpoint, not from a Chinese standpoint. Yeah.
Yeah.
If I can find it, I'll
Oh yeah.
because it really was a nifty book.
Yeah.
It's somewhere located in Book Manager if I could find it. Well, anyway, thank you very much, Patrick. Was that it from the online audience? So thank you all very much for coming out tonight, online audience. Thank you for joining us. You'll gather that since she's here, we have autographed copies of this wonderful book, Daughter of Calamity. And I will remind you that you only have an opportunity to buy a first novel when it publishes once. So it's a really good idea for a variety of reasons to purchase a copy. So thanks very much.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.